Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this month's NeuroSim webinar. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Sun, who's a PhD student at Caltech, advised by Pietro Corona and Yisong Yu. So she's been doing a lot of great work on AI for science, which she'll be telling us about today. So yeah, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Osbert. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you guys about our work on developing AI for scientists. So this area is very important to me because, as you may know, we face a lot of growing challenges in our world. One example is, of course, climate change, which requires observations and measurements from scientists all around the globe in order to study the impact of this phenomenon on factors such as ecology, human health, and agriculture. Of course, another challenge that we are probably all familiar with is the COVID pandemic, which totally changed our world for the past few years. And for when this virus first appeared, scientists had to rapidly analyze and interpret a lot of transmission data in order to figure out the best way to tackle this growing pandemic. And of course, another important aspect of health is our brain and mental health. And this type of data contains a lot of inherent ambiguities in terms of understanding the internal states, as well as human actions and behaviors, and which requires a lot of expert interpretation to address these ambiguities. And so we'd like to develop models that can help scientists tackle these growing challenges, which requires computational models that can handle large-scale data, potentially global-scale data, help scientists rapidly make analysis and interpretations on this data, as well as incorporate expert attention so that we can address potential ambiguities. And so just to be more concrete, so we see an example of the types of data we're talking about. Here's an example of a large-scale data from behavioral neuroscience. This type of data, as you can see, has videos of model organisms, such as mice, behaving and interacting in a cage over these large-scale video recordings. And on the right, you can see an example of the neural recording that's captured at the same time. And to manually analyze this data is very time consuming and is very expensive because it often requires domain expertise for scientists to analyze and quantify the behavior of these animals frame by frame. Additionally, some experiments might require a lot of different camera setups, as well as large-scale recordings over days, months, or even years. And so many times, scientists would interface with machine learning models, and these modern ML models have the capability of helping scientists automatically analyze these large-scale data sets. And so, a lot of my work, I develop AI for scientists, so models that can interface with scientists and their large-scale experimental data to extract different types of insights. For example, insights for cataloging different types of behavior that scientists have already identified, or even potentially helping scientists discover new behaviors that they may not have studied before. And in this area of AI for science, or developing AI for scientists, there has been a lot of great progress over the past few years. One example is this tool called the Mouse Action Recognition System, or MARS, which I've actually helped with, where we have computer vision models that can automatically extract pose data as well as behavior information from videos of these interacting animals. And once these pose and behavior information have been extracted, scientists can then correlate them with neural recordings, as you can see in the blue matrix on the right. Similar types of models have been used for other types of model organisms, such as fly. In this paper on the top, these authors are using models to quantify fly aggression and using that to study how brain circuits in the fly, such as this circuit in green, can govern different types of fly aggression. And of course, another organism we are all very interested in studying is humans. And here's an example data set from 12 different human participants where their brain recordings are used to correlate with different types of naturalistic behavior from the human participants. And one of my works worked with this data set in order to understand how these recordings relate across participants. And beyond behavioral neuroscience and neuroscience, you might be aware of a lot of great work that's been happening in chemistry as well as physics. So AI for science is generally like a growing and very exciting field. However, there still exist gaps that we would like to tackle. So one of the gaps is between how scientists or domain experts communicate with each other versus how they communicate with machine learning models. So here's an example of how scientists might communicate, an example of contact behavior to another scientist. So traditionally, scientists have used these ethogram drawings, which has one or two examples of what a behavior might look like. But in today's world with modern machine learning models, the way that now they encode this domain knowledge into these models is using large-scale data annotation. For example, they might need to annotate thousands of frames of annotations to give an example of a single behavior. And so there's this data efficiency gap in terms of how scientists would communicate with each other to how they would communicate with their machine learning models. And this challenge becomes even more important to address when we consider that scientists often do iterative discovery. So scientists are like at the frontier of knowledge, and often we don't know exactly everything we want to study ahead of time. And so given this video of interacting mice, scientists might start by studying, stiff or other behavior, and then figuring out, oh, inside other, I'm interested in studying meta attack. And then this can be even more fine-grained. And if we want to do this iterative discovery process with traditional supervised learning models, then this will require thousands of annotations of these behaviors at each iteration. And so this process can get very quickly, very expensive if we were to do this iterative discovery process. And even beyond data efficiency, there is an additional challenge in terms of these interpretability. So if we are working with scientists and they've identified a behavior, for example, say this rodent on the right-hand side is doing defensive behavior, we could ask scientists why they said that it's doing defensive behavior. And they might say, oh, because the ears are folded and it has an elongated posture. But then, of course, if we train our high-dimensional black box model, a convolutional neural network, for the most part, for these visual models, it could return the same label as what the scientist gave, but it will be hard to extract the same level of interval semantics back from this model without doing additional annotations. And so there exists these gaps right now in the field. And what occurs in practice then is that labs with different experimental setups and different domain knowledge, even for the same model organism, might train lab-specific analysis pipelines. And where the sharing occurs is after the machine learning model has extracted insights from this data, then labs, of course, would write papers and share the insights they discover from the data in the form of these papers. What I'm interested in doing with my work is to close the gaps that I had mentioned earlier and develop frameworks that enable labs to share insights earlier on in the analysis process. So perhaps in the data capturing stage as well as in the analysis stage. So models that can do cross-lab analysis and cross-experiment analysis instead of having these lab-independent analysis pipelines. And the approach I take in doing this is to take a scientist-in-a-loop perspective on the interaction between these models and scientists. So you might recognize this horizontal line of labeling data and training on the data as what you would do in a supervised paradigm. I'm also interested in models in the scientist-in-a-loop approach that can directly take in domain knowledge from scientists to train the model instead of going through this data labeling process. Going in the other direction, in terms of how scientists extract insights from models, I'm interested in models that can analyze the data, and then scientists can interpret the model through the data. But I'm also interested in inherently interpretable models that can directly give scientists insights on their experiments and the questions they're asking. So to make this more concrete, we can look at an example in behavior analysis, which we talked about earlier. So here we have data that might consist of interactions between different animals, and domain knowledge in the form of, say, speed or facing angle. So this domain knowledge represents behavior attributes that scientists often use for studying behavior. And one step that we could do on top of this raw data is to first perform some sort of structure discovery to discover lower dimensional interpretable structure from the data, such that this structure is more interpretable for scientists. For example, instead of using pixel level information, we could extract a structure, say, corresponding to nose and tail of the animals, so that scientists can start incorporating domain knowledge. And then so we have these frameworks that can incorporate domain knowledge from the scientists, and together with learning algorithms, learn these interpretations on the data. For example, this is a representation of how mouse aggression might be represented in terms of acceleration and the temporal filter. Then once we have these interpretations, we can then feed it back and build upon our domain knowledge, and help scientists do, say, new types of experimental design. For the domains I'm interested in, I guess, for example, we've talked about behavioral neuroscience a lot. And of course, I'm interested in how these models might help behavioral neuroscientists analyze their data. Behavior data is also one type of spatial temporal data, which also occurs in other domains, such as healthcare, which I've recently done some collaborations in this area, as well as fluid dynamics, where we have data that could help scientists, say, regress the wind speed from movements of tree branches. I'm going to pause here and just ask if there are any questions before I move on. Okay, feel free to ask in the chat or just unmute if you have questions at any time. But for the rest of this talk, I'll be first talking about our work on automatically discovering structure from these types of experimental data, as well as our work on integrating domain knowledge with learning. And so automatic structure discovery is very important because data often has lower dimensional structure that helps with the analysis process. For example, one example is if you observe a person with the same 3D posture from two different views, the pixel level information is very different, but this person literally has the same view. It's just captured from two different camera perspectives. And so to capture this view invariant property, a lot of downstream action recognition models would actually use the 3D pose of a person instead of using this essentially raw pixel level information. This is one example of where extracting this type of lower dimensional structure is very helpful for downstream analysis. Another example comes with this type of neural data that we talked about earlier. So instead of knowing like the frame by frame intensity of each individual pixel, what we actually want to know is spiking patterns of different neurons over time. And so what we actually want to do instead of looking at this raw data is to, for each neuron that we can see, have the spiking information over time. And another example is that even after we've extracted really low dimensional key point data, we could embed it into an even lower dimensional space where human annotated behavior can show up more obviously in the space compared to looking at the trajectory information. And so it is often beneficial to use this type of lower dimensional structure, but the challenge is that extracting this information often costs, for example, time and money, because it often needs annotations if you were to use a supervised model. Another challenge is that even if you were to ask humans to annotate this type of lower dimensional data, there's often a lot of ambiguity and variability in the annotations. Here's an example of key points that's been annotated by 5 different humans, and the ellipsis corresponds to variability from 5 human annotators annotating the same body part. And you'll see that while some body parts are less ambiguous, there are other ones where the uncertainty across human annotators is quite high. And so even if we were to ask humans to annotate, there's still this additional challenge. And here's another example of data that's very difficult for humans. So there's a jellyfish in this data that's shown. You guys can try for a few seconds to see where it is. By the way, I've only ever done this exercise in person, so I don't know if it's easier online for folks to see it. But if you can't see it, feel free to just annotate or let me know. Okay, I feel like it's probably still pretty difficult online.
I
Okay,
see
so
like a spot. I don't know if that's
oh wait, was it this spot?
no, it wasn't. So
Okay, oh no. Okay, but this demonstrates that some data is very difficult, even if you give it to human annotators to just identify these structures. And these spots that you see on the jellyfish corresponds to its mouth, for gonads and tentacle bulbs around the jellyfish. And the challenge with these bottlenecks is that if our lab was to study new model organisms or new experimental setups where there isn't as much data, it would take them like a large overhead in order to capture annotations for these new types of experimental setups or model organisms. And so we really want to reduce the barrier to entry of labs using these lower dimensional structure. The approach we take here is to train the model on the data, leveraging experimental, like assumptions on experimental setups, which I'll go into more detail of what they are in a second. For example, there are a lot of shared conditions across experiments that we can use to train our model to discover the structure. There's also a lot of spatial temporal relations often in scientific data. So this is an example from 12 different human participants corresponding to electrode locations on their brain. And you can see that there is a lot of overlap. Like, although each human doesn't have the full coverage of their brain, there's a lot of overlap in terms of spatial temporal location of these individual electrodes on the brain of a person. There's also a lot of information across different data streams that can be used for training. For example, in the multi-view example I gave earlier for studying 3D pose. But today I'll be focusing a lot more on this first shared condition across experiments. In this work, our goal is to discover these key points from behavioral videos with different animals without requiring any human annotations. These are sample teaser key points from our model. So just to get into this work, of course, we're not the first to do key point discovery. There has been previous works exploring key point discovery on organisms such as humans. However, we found that a lot of previous work is not directly applicable to our behavior videos. So here's an example of a frame from timestamp t, and this is the second frame is from timestamp t plus k. And a lot of the times, when training these structure discovery models, these models will use a reconstruction target. So to use the key points to reconstruct, say, a future frame. The challenge we found in using these models is that a lot of the times our organisms are very small or they're not centered. And so when we're performing reconstruction, there's a lot of model capacity that's just used on the background of the video itself instead of the actual organisms. And so we found that the results were that the key points that were discovered really didn't track these model organisms too well. So in our proposed approach, we changed the reconstruction target during training to reconstruct the spatial temporal difference of the organisms instead. This, using this training target leverages the observation that if you're running a behavior experiment, your background and your camera is usually stationary. And so if you simply take the difference across two images, what shows up is really the movements of the agents. And if you simply change the training target from, say, a future frame to difference between frames in these behavior experiments, you can discover key points that track semantically meaningful body parts on these organisms. And to go into more detail of our training process, again, we start from 2 frames in our video. So a frame at time t and a frame at time t plus k. And the first part is that we train this encoder-decoder model to extract key points in terms of XY locations from these images. And of course, we are in a self-supervised regime, so we don't have supervised annotations to know where the key point locations are, but rather our training signal is from using these key points as inputs to a model decoder to decode the image difference. And so how the decoder works is that it tries to decode the ground truth image difference. Ground truth computed from the ordinal input images using just the key points alone. And one thing you might have noticed is that these key points are really sparse. They may not capture all the parts of the agents. For example, there's no key points tracking the tail. Was there a question?
I had a quick question. Sorry. So these key points you're learning in a completely latent way, is that right?
Yeah, there's no other supervision besides a model reconstruction task.
Wow. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, I can go into more detail in a second. Yeah, so because the key points are sparse, as you may have observed, another input that we do feed into a decoder is appearance features at timestamp t. And the reason we do this is because the key points may not capture all the blobbiness or the tails of the mice, as an example. And so these appearance features provide additional information to make this decoding task possible for the decoder. And so the decoder gets 3 inputs: the appearance features from timestamp t, the key points from timestamp t, and only the key points from timestamp t plus k. And another loss that we use to regularize the key points is this idea of rotation covariance. So in addition to the reconstruction target I mentioned earlier, we also use rotation covariance as additional loss, because we know that if the original input image is rotated, then of course the key points should be rotating the same way. And so this is a representation of a heat map that captures the location of one of the key points. And so we're just saying that if the input image is rotated, then the heat map from your original input image should also be rotating the same way.
Wait, sorry, was
yep.
that? Sorry, I have another quick question. This is imposed as an extra loss, or is the network architecture automatically equivariant to rotation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in our framework, we've imposed it as an additional loss, but I do think it's actually compatible with network architectures. It's just that we chose to implement the training loss for this example. And then the last loss that we use is this key point separation loss, where it simply pushes the key points further apart if they're too close together. And I would say the main idea of our model is using the spatial temporal difference reconstruction as a training target. And so it's compatible with different types of architectures, as brought up your question earlier. And so going to the results, we first tested our model on some standard data sets. For example, for studying mice, fly, and humans, which are common organisms that people tend to look at in behavioral neuroscience, as well as for studying human behavior. And if we actually look at the key points, we see that they do track symmetrically consistent parts, but the human data set actually demonstrates one limitation, which is that when the person turns around, you can actually see that the points swapped in terms of left and right orientation. And that's actually something we like to tackle in future works. We then worked with labs who are working with more novel model organisms, such as jellyfish and trees. And then we can see that we were able to use our key points for downstream tasks relevant in these domains. For example, for regressing wind speed from the tree branch movement. And currently we're working with additional labs who are studying these model organisms in other settings. And so we're excited to see how these key points might lower the scientist effort required for using these structures. And feel free to let me know at any time you have questions. But for now, I'll move on to the quantitative results. Here, we quantitatively compare the performance of our key points using behavior classification. So in all of these cases, the behavior model itself is supervised, but here the key points, either supervised or self-supervised, are used as the inputs to the behavior classification model. So we can see that if we're using supervised key points, the models do really well. These key points were supervised with 15,000 frames. And if we look at self-supervised models, we see that using our method of using spatial temporal difference reconstruction, our behavior classification model works a lot better since our key points are able to track these semantically consistent body parts. So moving on to use cases, we are really excited to see how these key points might interface with scientists in their workflow. Of course, one example of using these key points is to do reconstruction without using any human annotations, as we discussed earlier. We can also train these key points in a semi-supervised way because there are labs that know which key points they want to track, and they already have existing annotations. So in these cases, our key points can actually be trained jointly with a supervised objective to improve the efficiency of these supervised models. And finally, our models can be used to initialize experiments. So in settings where it's difficult for humans to identify key points, as we discussed earlier, our models can be used as an initialization procedure and have an expert in the loop set up to adjust these key points. In terms of implications, our idea of using spatial temporal difference reconstruction have led to new algorithms that we're also currently exploring in 3D. We've explored our key points in new domains, such as for regressing wind speed from the movement of these tree branches using our self-supervised key points. And right now we're working with different labs to deploy our method in practice. For example, with SLEEP, which is like a popular supervised pose estimation model, to see how self-supervision might improve this analysis pipeline. Here are some preliminary results in the 3D case, where we essentially extend our idea of using spatial temporal difference to multi-view video to track the movement of this rat. Let me know if there's any questions at this point before I move on to the domain knowledge plus learning part of the talk.
I have one quick question. So you said you can also do semi-supervised?
Mm-hmm.
Does that get you better final results, or is it just faster convergence?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the semi-supervised case, we mostly notice an improvement in data efficiency. So it really depends on how many key points the lab has annotated ahead of time. So like if it's a very small number of key points, that our model can improve in data efficiency as well as the performance. But if it's already a super large amount of key points, then we notice that the improvement plateaus, like based on how many key points they already have annotated in the lab.
Right. Sorry, I guess my question was more, so using the human ground truth does improve performance, right? It's better than the self-supervised key points, is that right? Because in an earlier plot, you showed that they were close.
Yeah, I see your question. Yeah, so I think in terms of behavior classification, they're already very close. Just going back to the quantitative results. I would say the main benefit of using the semi-supervised case is if there are specific key points that the labs really wants to track. For example, our self-supervised key points might not discover the years of these mice. But then if
I guess I was wondering if
case,
you can also do better than super.
Oh, I think in terms of doing better than supervised, I think it goes back to it depends on how much data they've already annotated. So in the low data regime, using a semi-supervised model does improve the performance, but the improvement does plateau based on how many data you have annotated. We have like a curve in our paper in terms of this.
Thanks.
Yeah, how it works. If there are no questions, moving on to domain knowledge plus learning. Yeah, so for this particular area, I'm really interested in models that can directly encode domain knowledge from scientists instead of relying on the traditional supervised paradigm to annotate a lot of data and use that for training. And so the domain knowledge that we have in our behavior analysis domain is structured knowledge, such as these facing angles of mice or speed, as we discussed earlier. We can also have different compositions. So sometimes we know that the compositions of two conditions is important for identifying a behavior. For example, for identifying chase between two mice, the speed should be large and they should also be relatively close together. We also have certain constraints in our experiments. For example, we know that the mice can exit the cage. And so we are interested in models that can incorporate these symbolic abstractions, program synthesis, as well as deep learning. And you guys might know where I'm going with this. So we've explored neurosymbolic programming a lot to be able to encode domain knowledge from scientists, as well as produce more interpretable models that can help scientists interpret behavior data. And of course, this neurosymbolic programming is part of this larger movement, which feel free to check out the link. And so in terms of the domain knowledge, the ways that we encode domain knowledge, one way that we've explored is to encode domain knowledge as training tasks for neural networks to improve the data efficiency of these models and result in more structured representations. This is a direction that I'll be mostly talking about for the second half of this talk. Another way that we can encode domain knowledge is, of course, by learning symbolic programs. And we've explored this area a little bit to see how we can improve interpretability of our models compared to neural networks. So this example on the left shows an output from a 1D ComNet. And the example on the right shows an output from our neurosymbolic model. And using program synthesis, we found that we were able to learn more structured models that's easier for domain experts to interpret. But for today, I'll be focusing more on how we can use these training tasks to guide the training of neural networks. So we were motivated by the observation that annotation for training is very expensive. Even if we have, even if we know which behavior to study, it can still take hundreds of thousands of frames for behavioral neuroscientists to annotate the data and produce annotations. For example, in this particular use case, this data had over 700,000 frames, corresponding to over 28 hours of annotations. Using our method, we were able to reduce the data requirements by up to 90%. So having annotations that's doable in just 3 hours, which is hopefully doable in 1 afternoon versus like 1 or 2 weeks. And how we were able to do this is by looking at what type of domain knowledge already exists in the domain. And so looking at this video, we first asked how domain experts annotate behavior in this setting. So how do domain experts identify sniff when they're looking at the video? And I won't make you guys annotate sniff behavior in this full video, but rather just go to some examples where if we look at frames of sniff and no sniff, you can probably see some patterns in terms of how these animals are interacting. So in the sniff case, we see that the nose of the resident mouse, which is a black mouse, is facing the intruder mouse, which is a white mouse. And of course, the nose is very close to the body or other parts of the intruder mouse. In the no sniff case, the distance between the mice is very large. And so the mice are not really interacting and they may not be facing each other. And this is a type of domain knowledge that we would like to capture in our framework. For example, these behavior attributes that enable us to identify sniff. We are also interested, for example, in other types of behavior, like chase, which could be represented by having very large speeds and mice are close to each other. Another example is rearing, where the mouse is actually, instead of being flat, is standing up. And if you have key point in 2D, rearing kind of corresponds to the neck key point being close to the tail key point of the mouse. And in other organisms, this type of structured knowledge also exists. For example, for studying fly behavior, the wing angle of flies is very important for identifying behaviors like wing extension. And so we want to develop a framework that you can incorporate these different types of domain knowledge with neural network training. So as we discussed earlier, we have all of these features and these handcrafted heuristics that already exist in these domains for studying behavior. On the other hand, we have representation learning models that enable us to learn representations from data using, say, high dimensional models like neural networks. And so we want to develop a framework that can unify both feature design as well as representation learning. And our framework is called task programming, which I'll go into detail in a little bit, which is inspired by the data programming paradigm, which unifies feature design and weak supervision for training. In our case, task programming unifies feature design and representation learning. And how we do this is in the first step. scientists would identify important attributes from the data. For example, these attributes could correspond to a distance between mice. And since we are working with trajectory data, we know the semantics of these key points. For example, we know which key point is a nose. And if we already know where the nose coordinates are from trajectory data, it's very simple to just write a program to compute the distance between these nose coordinates. And these programs are what we call lambda tau in our framework. And so in the second step, we now train our neural networks. So in training our neural networks, we do take advantage of self-supervision. If you're familiar with variational autoencoders and self-supervision, here we're training our model using an autoencoder just for trajectory reconstruction. So the goal of the encoder and decoder is just to embed these trajectory data in a lower dimensional space and then decode it to reconstruct the trajectory. And of course, in a self-supervised setting, our loss is based on the input trajectory data. The second half of our framework now uses the programmatic labels that we've designed in the previous slide. So it takes advantage of these lambda taus, which encodes important behavior attributes. And you can see that there's a few different ways that we're using these lambda taus for training. More concretely, one example that we use these lambda taus is that we use that to enforce attribute consistency on the data. And so how we do this is that because we know lambda tau represents an important behavior attribute, like say the distance between mice, this loss is saying that the reconstructed trajectory should also preserve that attribute that's enforced in the input data. And so if the mice are close to each other in the input trajectory, they should also be close to each other in the reconstructed trajectory. Another way of using these lambda taus is by doing attribute decoding directly from the representations. So this loss is saying that since distance is such an important attribute for studying behavior, I should be able to decode it, like I should be able to train a shallow network, this decoder 2, to decode it from the representation space itself. And so the representation space should not only be able to reconstruct the trajectory data, but also contain information about these important attributes that I want to use for studying behavior. Are there any questions on the methods at this point? Okay, so moving on to the results. So the way we evaluate this model is using data efficiency. So this data efficiency is based on this baseline is based on the feature design. So for example, these features that we discussed earlier, that was handcrafted by domain experts, such as facing angle or distance or speed of the animals. And here the x-axis contains performance of the behavior classification model at different amounts of training fraction. Now, of course, as you can see, if the training fraction decreases, then the classification error increases. Now, using our learned features in combination with feature design, we see that we're able to reduce the errors dramatically. And if we draw a dotted line at where feature design achieves the lowest classification performance at 100% of the training data, we see that using 10% of the data, our model performs comparably. And these task programming features are those that were learned using the losses I discussed earlier, in using programmatic supervision and self-supervision to train the representation space. And using these types of neurosymbolic models, we have explored how we can describe human annotations using these models by training temporal filters and learning the feature compositions that are useful for studying different behaviors in order to describe human annotations. We have also integrated this type of symbolic knowledge with weak supervision. So the way that we have done this in this framework is by using program synthesis to automatically learn different programs that can correspond to different behaviors, and using these programs to produce pseudo labels for a data set at scale to train neural networks. And we also have explored training these programs in an unsupervised way. So in the works I've discussed previously, we've studied behavior using human annotations but there are cases where we want to discover new behaviors. And in this last work for using neurosymbolic encoders, we use these neurosymbolic encoders in a variation of the encoder framework to learn both a fully symbolic encoder as well as a neuroencoder for studying behavior. And the fully symbolic encoder produces interval programs that can be used for domain experts to study the clusters that were discovered. And just to give a quick recap of the works we've discussed, we've looked at using self-supervised key points where we don't require any human annotated data, and we were able to discover key points corresponding to semantically meaningful body parts that have comparable accuracy for downstream behavior classification compared to using supervised key points. In the case of task programming, we propose a framework that can integrate human domain knowledge with representation learning to produce representations that is expert friendly and requires less supervised data for downstream behavior analysis. If there's any questions at this point, happy to discuss more. Otherwise, I will continue on to future directions that I'm really excited about. Okay, so future directions. So as I discussed earlier, I'm really excited in these interactions between scientists and machine learning models and how we can train these models that interface with scientists to automatically help scientists extract insights from these large-scale experimental data. For example, in the case of behavioral neuroscience with our animal interactions. One of my goals is to develop frameworks that can help unify analysis efforts across labs. So instead of labs sharing insights at the very end in the form of these papers, having frameworks that can hopefully help scientists put together analysis efforts earlier on in this process. I think this direction is very important because a lot of complex phenomena span across different experiments. For example, we've talked about behavioral neuroscience, where we have these animal behavior interactions and neural recordings. Of course, animal behavior is studied in a lot of other fields, such as, say, animal behavior in the wild, where we have, animals that might walk across a camera trap and do some behavior and then head out. This allows us to study behavior more in the natural context of the animal instead of in these experimental setups, which could be very interesting. There's other types of behaviors that I haven't talked about today. For example, maternal behavior, which some lab focuses on in terms of how mother mice might raise their pups. Of course, when we're talking about in the wild, animal habitats are also very important in terms of how they influence animal behavior. And there's a lot of different modalities beyond vision that is important for studying behavior, such as audio signals. But currently, a lot of these analysis pipelines, especially those across different fields, is performed independently. I'm really interested in putting everything together because I think unifying these prior knowledge and experiments is important in building a more general neurosymbolic model that can help scientists do reasoning in other parts of the scientific process. So here's one example of how this might be done, where we could have priors from neuroscience, we could have priors from physiology as well as biomechanics. And having priors across all these fields is very important to reason about the effect of interventions on different aspects of animal behavior, such as with the rising temperatures today, how would animal behavior change given a changing temperature? Understanding both behavior from the neuroscience side, but also from physiology as well as biomechanics is crucial in order to reason about these interventions. And earlier on in the talk, I've really focused on models that can do analysis and interpretation given the experimental setup. But what we really like to do is to close a loop in these analysis processes and help scientists reason about interventions, as well as designing new experimental setups for different fields. And one way that one could imagine doing this is, so in my current work shown on the right, I've talked a lot in this talk about how we can take data and domain knowledge from domain or experiment specific data and knowledge, and help scientists automatically produce interpretations from these large scale data. But as you guys may be aware, there is a lot more general knowledge out there, and there's a lot of work in studying these models that you can call general human knowledge. For example, using knowledge graphs or different types of pre-trained models. Large language models is one specific example that's quite popular right now for encoding general knowledge. So I'm interested in how these general knowledge and domain-specific knowledge might interface to help scientists interpret data, in a more efficient way. I think there's a lot of open questions in terms of what's the best way to adapt these models with general human knowledge in these labs with lab-specific, domain-specific knowledge, as well as questions on how we can use these interpretations and actually help build these models with more general knowledge. So one example perhaps could be to use, say, language models to extract semantics from experimental data and use these extracted semantics in our interpretation step. So that's one possible direction that we could explore. And so looking at the space of all of these models, of course, we have being more general in terms of our domain knowledge, but also more diverse in terms of our tasks. And a lot of my current work has focused on reducing scientist effort in the case where our domain knowledge is known or lab specific, and where our task is well defined. In the future, I would like to explore models that can integrate more general types of domain knowledge, such as those from different fields, into our learning process to help scientists reason about diverse types of tasks and close a loop in terms of how we do data analysis and in terms of how we do experimental design and hypothesis design. And so to end the talk, I would really like to thank all of my collaborators, as well as sponsors for different challenges, and as well as you guys for listening. Thanks again. And let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for the great talk. I guess we can open the floor to questions if anyone wants to just ask. So yeah, maybe I can get started. So I had kind of a, yeah, you mentioned in your future work that you're interested in kind of looking at these interventions and how it can help the scientists downstream understand the data better. So yeah, I was wondering if there was anything, and it seems like neurosymbolic is part of this, right? So do you envision, like, what exactly do you envision here in terms of what might be useful in some, like in, say, the mouse domain to show the scientist?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So for example, maybe one example is right now, even after we do an intervention, it can be difficult to tell what has changed in terms of the behavior. Since the animals are behaving naturalistically, like we mentioned earlier, it might not be clear what behaviors are interesting ahead of time. And so if we know what the interventions are, and say another lab has done a similar type of intervention, I'm interested in models that can extract that information and say suggest behaviors for experts to study, given that their intervention might be similar. So in some sense, learning a space of interventions and a space of behaviors and connecting that together. And say the interventions could be, there's labs studying optogenetics, which activates different parts of the brain. There's labs studying different strains of animals. There's labs studying, like, say, different rearing conditions of the animals. And so having models that can connect those together, say labs with similar interventions, is something that's interesting to me.
I see. So I guess then a follow-up question is, when you're thinking about these as so when, like, the ones you showed, you were learning the latent structure was like the key points, but does this mean that your neurosymbolic model would now the latent structure are these other kinds of interventions? Like, are you imagining that they would be explicitly represented in the model, and that's how you would?
Right. So I think the model, ideally, in the ideal case, I'm interested in models that can represent the interventions, like you mentioned, as well as the behaviors. So in some sense, the key points are important, especially in lab studying biomechanics. It's important to know where the body parts are. But in a lot of cases, we would like to extract even more information from the key points.
Right.
And have explicitly the specific behaviors like aggression or chase, which is another level beyond key points. And so having models that can do both key points and behavior is very important in addition to interventions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, are there other questions from the audience? Okay, so I actually had one more question for you. So you also mentioned the large language models, which is something I think, it is a very exciting source of knowledge, but it's kind of unwieldy, right? Because it's, it's hard to actually tell. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, I don't know if you've had a chance to kind of play with any of these, but, when you're thinking about integrating them, what kind of an interface do you have in mind for kind of extracting useful knowledge from them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think I've seen these models work in certain cases, for example, where, for example, for a frame like this, there are vision language models that can do like zero shot identifying which one's the black mouse or the white mouse. But even when we're doing these experiments, we need to know more than that. Like we need to know more than, oh, this is a black mouse or a white mouse. Like we sort of need to know these experiment specific behaviors. And so I'm interested in seeing if these models can be, say, fine-tuned or otherwise extract some other higher level useful semantics from the data. I think one question that I'm interested in seeing is like to what extent, like how far can you push the generalization ability of these models in some sense? Because of course our data looks very different in distribution from data you pull on the internet, but that is trained, these large language models are trained on so much data that maybe they're able to generalize to these experiments anyway. I think this is a question that is still an open question in terms of how much they do generalize to our experiment data. And that's something I want to explore. Like suppose they do generalize, that I think is going to be very exciting for the field. If they don't generalize, I think exploring new methods to integrate them as deeply as possible in terms of the information they extract beyond, oh, this is a black mouse and this is a white mouse, I think is going to be more useful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. So I guess yeah, any other questions? Last chance. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Giving a great talk. So yeah, and I guess we'll see you all at the next, I guess in 2 months for the next Neurosym webinar. Bye.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks for the talk. Bye. Thank you.